Everyone knows how much Americans love America, but what I was more interested in was what the rest of the world thought of us. So for my Christmas break to Canada, I decided to interview Canadians on America. The results were eye-opening. So when you think of America, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
A world dominant culture, I guess. Global power.
So when you think of America, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
First thing that comes to mind? Bully.
Bullet?
Yes, I did too. Yes.
Okay. And then what would you say is the major difference from America?
Our lifestyle is a lot better than their lifestyle.
Like, yeah, what, just one more thing I would add is the war.
In almost every interview, Canadians referred to America as either a bully, dominating, or controlling. When I lived in England, most of the people either didn't care about America or loved the idea of America. What made Canada so different? I decided to ask a Canadian living in America on her thoughts. At first, I was surprised that Canada was so fearful of the United States. With the biggest free border in the world and the largest trade partnership, it seemed the United States and Canada were destined to be perfect allies. But after some research, I learned of the reasoning behind the bittersweet relationship. Over the course of 250 years, the United States had invaded Canada twice, prepared to invade in the 30s again, in the 60s threatened to cut off the special relationship, and in a myriad of cases, illegally detained Canadian citizens without due process or rights. Was this how the United States approached its own allies? Think of America, what comes to mind?
A lot of thoughts. So I have a lot of thoughts that come to mind when I think of the U.S. I guess the very first thing I think of is probably stars and stripes, right? I think big old flags everywhere, kind of unbridled patriotism. That's probably more a product of where I grew up, though. Having lived here, I haven't seen as much of that sort of thing.
Why is that a product of how you've grown up?
Because I come from a country that is sort of passively aggressively patriotic. I come from a place that's very concerned about being overwhelmed by sort of a loud, boisterous neighbor. We have all these laws that protect, like, how many hours our music is played on the radio, how much content has to be Canadian on television. There's a persistent fear of being I wouldn't say necessarily taken over, but a persistent fear of being pushed around economically or even in the international scene by Americans. And so our sense of patriotism is often defining ourselves as not being American. We are neither British nor American, we're Canadian.
You had to pinpoint one thing.
One thing. I think of the U.S. as being a very me-oriented society. I don't think Canada's like that. I think the U.S., I think this idea that you guys are kind of like the new Rome. I think that allows you to walk into other nations and do what you, not necessarily to do what you please, but there's a kind of dominance, almost bully-like attitude, particularly about this administration, but about other administrations, that just doesn't exist in Canada because we neither have the economic nor military resources for that. Oh, that also, you guys are a republic, and we're not. And there's a big difference between nations, the attitude in nations that are republics, that fight for independence from somebody else. Very, very different than countries who are dominions. So, you guys have this incredible patriotism. It's very me-centered. There's an attitude amongst the first couple people that I lived with in the U.S. It was very much about this sort of manifest destiny that this nation.
My trip to Canada allowed me to understand from a foreign perspective the effects of the United States foreign policy. It was one of those rare trips that always remain meaningful.